All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's webinar. It's a state of industry of the connected cars. And I'm joined by Kyle Ellicott, the Chief Labs Officer of ReadWrite Labs, and by Liz Slocum, our SME for the connected car industry. Good morning. So before we get started, a quick brief on who we are and what we do. ReadWrite Labs is an industry catalyst dedicated to the Internet of Things. We provide research, education, and events to the world's most innovative IoT companies. Our secondary research is accessible on our platform at readwritelabs.com. I encourage you to register and track industry insight and stay up to date with what's happening in your industry. We also offer custom primary research by surveying our community of over 500,000 technology users who are also subscribers to our weekly newsletters. We are founded in 2014 with offices in US and Asia. We are the leading voice on emerging technology, and we do this by building landscapes. Our landscapes are built working with leading SMEs in the industry. The taxonomy presents a story centered around use cases, and our AI-powered data platform allows you to track these companies on the landscape. You can download these landscapes through our platform. And for today's connected car landscape, we would be emailing it to you after the webinar. As a reminder, our webinars are highly interactive, so please feel free to post your comments or questions in the Q&A box. You can find this on the Zoom toolbar. Kyle would help moderate this webinar and would be taking these questions either during the webinar if it's in the flow, or we would save them for the end. We have been looking at multiple landscapes in the mobility space, and one of the landscapes that we are doing today is the connected cars. But keeping in mind the amount of innovation happening in this space, we are looking at mobility as such through multiple landscapes. We have the connected cars. We also have building new landscapes that covers different industries in space. These could include last mile delivery, drones. We'd also look at fleet management, smart cities, micro-mobility, etc. So today I'll introduce Liz, and without any further ado, I would love to have her jump on and talk to us a little bit more about the connected car landscape and the update over the last few quarters. Now, Liz has experienced the space firsthand as a founder of a company, as well as an evangelist, and she's been in this space since 2013. Good morning, Liz.
Good morning, Kailash. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I can. All right, I'll get started then. Good morning. I'm Liz Slocum, and I got started in connected cars in 2013 when I started my own company called Road Rules, and that was a developer's platform that connected any kind of car. So I've since been researching about cars and IoT. I have contributed to VentureBeat, and now I'm working with ReadWrite Labs. And then I also run my own website called Pseudocat, and the address is pseudocat.sh, and that's where I post my research about emerging technologies. So here is the connected car ecosystem, and there are four main ways that the car connects to the internet. There's, starting in the upper left, we have vehicle to vehicle, in which the cars talk to each other, and an example of that is Peloton, in which they do truck platooning. Next, we have vehicle to infrastructure, and that example is when cars talk to the roads or the lights or parking lot spots. For example, Fiber embeds a device in a parking spot. Inrix has sensors in the road, so that's how they get information about parking availability and road conditions and traffic. Next, we have vehicle to mobile, in which there is a third-party device or an aftermarket third-party device that connects to the internet. So in some cases, we have a dongle that plugs into the diagnostics port and has cell phone connectivity, and that's Mojio, or sometimes it's tethered through the phone like Mirrorlink. Next, we have vehicle to cloud, and you'll see those examples where the car comes from the factory connected to the internet. So famous examples include Tesla, there is Nissan Connect, and Android Auto is an example where it comes in through the phone, but they're also installing it in factories in the cars. And all of the services and apps center around safety, security, communications, and entertainment. So let's talk about the landscape and how it was built, with the philosophy behind it. So it starts at the bottom here on the connected edge, and those are the things, the devices, the cars, the sensors in the road that collect the raw data. And that raw data moves through the smart networks and then continues up into the smart cloud, where it aggregates all the data and pushes it to the smart data, where then the raw data is then translated into insights and then pushed up towards consumer and enterprise apps. So here's the latest version of our connected cars landscape, and I will go into each section in more detail. So we're starting here with the raw data that I was talking about. Here are the things, the devices. And we have, from the last version of our landscape, we have the car add-ons, which are the dongles that I talked about, like Vinly and Mojio. And then on the other side of the screen, we have the heads-up displays, the infotainment embedded systems, which are the systems that are installed at the factory. And then I have changed the taxonomy for semiconductors. I'm now calling them embedded systems, because there is a lot of other circuits and ECUs that are included in this section right here. So what's new is that I am deferring autonomous vehicles to another landscape managed by Mark Abelard. So what I have instead replaced that area with electric scooters, electric motorcycles, and electric vehicles. And then also I did include sensors that are a big part of AV, but they're a big part of connected cars as well. So these are sensors that help with ADAS systems, and there's driver behavior conditions that this helps with. So for example, there's a company called Bayar, and they use radio frequency sensors in the car for passenger behavior and presence, as well as driver behavior. So for example, a common use case that people talk about are babies inadvertently getting left in cars. And so Bayar addresses that issue. Next, we have smart networks. So this is what helps the cars talk to the infrastructure. Then we have smart data, and what has changed here is that I have renamed mapping to location-based services. Mapping started to get a little bigger when you introduce AV, so I wanted to be more specific about what this to just connected cars. So this is where we include navigation like Waze and Google Maps and Here. Now, we did keep machine vision, perception, and sensor fusion because there is still a lot of raw data that's coming in and being used to understand the environment within a connected car. Next, we have urban mobility, and we also have route optimization. And those are definitely raw, the data companies so we have route optimization. It is the mathematical algorithms that help us optimize our navigation. So some of those examples include JROP. And then we have urban mobility, and they help us get around, but the information doesn't come just from the cars, it comes from various other places. So for example, streetlight data, they get some of their data from cellular networks to see how people move around. And then that information is helpful for urban planners and real estate developers.
Hey, Liz, real quick, back on that last section, we had a quick question from Charlie. He was asking about the machine vision section, and if you've seen or if you've thought about the inclusion of license plate recognition. If you've seen any companies, or is that an area of interest in the machine vision section?
It is. I would say it's adjacent, more with smart cities, but they have been doing that. There was an interesting I was at a Stanford journalism conference, and this is a couple years ago, about scanning that happens with license plates. And it was more about the technology used then and how often license plates can get scanned. I could look that up. I'm not sure, I can't remember the article about it, but it does happen now where police enforcement goes around, parking enforcement goes around and scans licenses, and it's and your license can get scanned thousands of times. But yeah, it's something that's real now, and it's and they use technology that's been available for years. So I don't have any specific companies to call out on that one though.
Great, thank you.
So next we have smart cloud, and this is where cybersecurity falls in. And I have actually written quite a bit about cybersecurity because I have read all the major research on it. Most of what you'll see in the news is research-based. And so I've written on VentureBeat as well as on the Black Duck software blog. So you can actually link to my articles on that to get my full opinions on that off my personal website, and that's lizslocum.com. Other than that, there thankfully aren't a lot of cases of malicious attacks on cars. So I commend these companies for doing a great job. Next, we have the consumer area. And this is what you hear about a lot in the news and you talk about with your friends. So you have car sharing, such as Get Around. We have diagnostics, infotainment applications, ride sharing, carpooling, ride hailing, usage-based insurance, parking, which I always like parking. There are companies like Spot Angel and Spot Hero, where I think that this is an interesting step towards payments in the car, which is always a subject that I have an interest in. Next, we have on-demand rentals, and this is new and expanded this time around to include the scooters and the bike rentals that you see. So Line Bikes is in here, and Bird, as well as Skip is also another one. And then EV charging, and this is a section that hasn't expanded a lot in the last couple of years, but as I'll talk about later when I talk about EVs, this is about ready to blow up. For example, Porsche just has its new charging system. There's already ChargePoint that's been around, but EV is about to have is going to have its moment right now. So I'll talk about that more in detail later. Next, we have driver behavior. I do have Metromile in here as an insurance-based, usage-based insurance company that also tracks driver behavior. And there are companies that try to help rate drivers, and then they pass that on to rideshare companies. Here we have the enterprise area, and the two biggest areas here are fleet tracking and asset management and distribution and logistics. So truck fleets, these are companies that are trying to digitize trucking and logistics. And so companies include Keep Trucking, as well as Black Buck just raised some money. And I'll talk about that really briefly soon. So we also have the infotainment interfaces. So those are the software applications that you interface with in your car. Then we have the app platforms, and I always have a special place in my heart for these companies because this is where I got started. So we have companies like Tesla and Smart Car, where they started out just like me, looking at what the Tesla can do and the applications and services involved there. And then we have CarForce, which helps dealers upsell and helps consumers get in and make sure that they get the maintenance that they need. We have the telematics. Next, we have the telematics service providers who help make the car connected at the factory level. And then teleoperations, which is relatively new, and that's remote control driving. So let's talk about the emerging trends. Some quick takes on the landscape that we just looked at. So we have a few new industries that might be coming out. One of them is cargo, and that's the idea of doing to me, it's like a side hustle for Uber drivers. So when you get into your ride-hailing car, your driver can then sell you snacks or amenities in the car. So cargo is taking care of that. And like I just mentioned with Black Buck, they just raised $12 million Did I get that right, Kailash? 12 million? Is that what we just discussed? And they are helping to digitize. They are the largest trucking platform in India, and they're helping to digitize that industry. Also, what we'll see is we've seen is a consolidation of on-demand services. So Uber is a big example of that, where it's not just a ride that you can get off of their app. You can get Uber Eats, you can get food, you can get a bike, you can get a scooter. So we'll see how the ride-hailing companies are transforming right now. Next, I want to talk about how the EV era is finally here. Here's a timeline that I put together about what's going on in EVs. And I broke this down into corporate goals, and then I also covered a few of the forecasts as well as the government mandates that are coming. So I'll start by talking about the corporate goals. So what happened in 2018 is there were quite a few announcements about companies investing in EVs. So Ford's going to invest $11 billion by 2022. GM, as they were laying off 14,000 US factory workers, in the same announcement, they also announced that their resources for EVs will double in the next 2 years. And Volkswagen is going to invest $50 billion over the next 5 years. And then the next part of the corporate goals is that they were making announcements about how their sales goals. And as you can see from this, $1 million seems to be the magic number that they're choosing for their benchmark. So Volvo wants to sell 1 million electrified vehicles, so that's hybrids and EVs by 2025. Volkswagen wants to produce 1 million EVs by 2025. Nissan wants to sell 1 million hybrids and EVs by 2022. The other announcements that corporations are making about how much they are expanding their portfolios. So Kia has announced that they will offer 19 EVs by 2022, and Ford, in partnership with Zotier in China, will introduce at least 15 hybrids and EVs in China by 2025. So these are actually pretty big portfolios, and what I'll show is that a lot of them are their portfolios for China. Next, I want to talk about the government mandates. I had just finished reading The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis, and one of his main themes is that government is what makes things work, and it's what drives innovation. So we'll see here that there are these government mandates around the world, and this is actually what's pushing these companies to change their goals and redraw their product roadmaps. So Norway is the golden child of examples, because they're a really good example of how to make EVs work and get adoption. They have a lot of generous incentives. So coming up, their goal is to sell only cars that are 100% electric by 2025. 2025 is a big year. So China wants to sell 7 million cars sold every year, and they think that that's going to be about 20% of the total cars being sold, and those will be both plug-in hybrids or battery powered. And this is because, as I will show later, China is the largest market. This is having a huge impact on what all the other what the corporations are planning for.
And Liz, real quick, right now this timeline that you're showing looks like it's more focused around the consumer side. Mm-hmm. What type of trends are you seeing in the more city infrastructure side? For instance, earlier, was it last year in 2018, the city of Shenzhen switched all of their buses from gas over to electric. There's several other cities around the world that are pushing the same initiative. Is there any correlation you're seeing, or were you able to see any big drive around a similar initiative? So not just goals around how many cars we want to sell, but also how many cars we want to change over in cities or trains over in general.
Yeah, there are some major cities that do have initiatives like you're talking about, as well as including their own bans. I can't name them off the top of my head right now, though.
Charlie just let us know that Houston is very close to 100% EV in their city, electric vehicles with city vehicles. So thank you, Charlie, for that stat. He lives in Houston, so if it's wrong, we're coming back to you, Charlie. But cool, thank you very much, Liz.
Thanks. So next we have Norway. In 2030 is the next milestone. So Norway is looking at heavy duty vehicles. So they want 75% of new long distance buses and 50% of new trucks must be zero emissions by 2030. And then, so this is the federal government ban versus the cities specifically. But Germany is going to have wants to have a total ban on internal combustion engines or ICE by 2030. And India wants 30% of all new vehicles to be electric by that same year. And then looking forward to 2040, France is planning an ICE ban on all petrol, so a ban on petrol and diesel, as well as the UK. So then how does this affect what's going to happen with and what we think is going to happen? So these are the forecasts that are coming out of Bloomberg and the International Energy Agency. So there's a prediction that by 2022, there are going to be 2.5 million electrified vehicles sold in China. In the mid-2020s, it's expected that we're going to hit peak oil use for cars. In 2026, the upfront cost of EVs will equal that of ICE vehicles. And then in 2040, all of these EVs are going to displace 3 million barrels a day of oil. And it's expected that 55% of new cars will be EVs. So what does this mean? There is the forecast that 2018 may have been the peak internal combustion engine. So in a report published in late 2018, several experts told the Financial Times that they believe that sales of fossil fuel-powered ICE vehicles peaked in 2018. And this means that it's unlikely that more ICE cars will be sold in any future year. So this is a change from earlier predictions at the beginning of 2018 that the demand of ICE vehicles wouldn't peak until 2022 at the earliest. And the experts say that this is a combination of several factors, including Brexit, the US-China trade war, as well as new emission targets in Europe that are focusing on renewable energy. So as I just showed you, regulation is coming. 5 years ago, automakers talked about EVs as if it was just a minimum requirement to meet regulation. And so they would release compact-based model cars just to meet that regulation. But in 2018, we saw a shift that legacy automakers are starting to focus on EVs as the mainstream option, flagship option. So for example, Audi unveiled their EV e-tron as a flagship EV, which is their sports utility vehicle. As I mentioned before, Porsche has a fast charging system that they are saying is a compelling business case for a variety of operators. Proterra is a privately held maker of electric buses, and they received $155 million in new investment from Daimler, and they plan to expand into the school bus market. Also, Hyundai Motor Group invested an additional $250 million in Grab Holdings, so that they could sell a fleet of electric vehicles to the Singapore-based ride-hailing company. And in terms of infrastructure in the homes, you'll see that in 2017, there was an estimated 3 million private chargers at homes and in workplaces. So we're starting the infrastructure to really come up and make it more accessible to people. And as I will go in the next few slides, that EV sales are on the rise, and we'll see how that's affecting global sales. So this graph compares the entry-level luxury cars sales in 2018 in the US, and this shows that the Tesla Model 3 was more popular this year than the combined entry-level luxury offerings of Audi, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz. But this will likely change. So you'll notice that there is a downturn here in late summer for Tesla Model 3s. And that is because there was a federal credit that is getting phased out. So US automakers were able to get consumers were able to get a $7,500 credit. And once 200,000 plugins are registered in the US, then it triggers a phase out period. And that's what that is there.
Hey, Liz, real quick, do you see that as a growing trend? I mean, now that that's going to be gone, do we think that that's going to flatten sales on a global level, or do you think that we're going to still continue to see things rise? I mean, $7,500 kickback on an electric vehicle, whether it's a Tesla, BMW, or the like, that's a pretty good return, a rebate, if you will. So, how do you think that's going to affect things going forward?
So it's going to affect it, but you'll kind of, for a while, you'll at least see consumer, like almost like a basic microeconomic choice of consumers trying to find the best deal. So for example, and this makes consumers need to consider how much the incentive factors into their buying decision. So for example, in Ontario, Canada, residents could receive up to $14,000 in rebates for an EV, such as a Leaf. And so for a Leaf, an MSRP is about $36,000. So it's quite a bit of the MSRP. And then last July, Ontario canceled this program, and Nissan Canada reported that they sold 695 EVs in Ontario in August. And once that was canceled and people and consumers didn't qualify for it, the sales dropped to 10. So,
wow.
So these types of incentives matter.
And one other quick question. This will be more for the general audience as a whole. So Miho asked the question of what was the definition of ICE, ICE, and does it include mid to full hybrid vehicles, or does it just include EVs? I think that might have got missed by a few people. So
sorry.
No,
it
okay.
was in internal combustion engines. So those are the petrol and diesel fueled cars.
Got it. Awesome. And then one other question from Peter, and I think you might be covering this in just a moment, but I want to throw it out there is, as we're moving towards electric vehicles, as a growing trend, when will it make sense for the cross-country driver versus short range type mobility? And again, I think you might be getting to this a little bit, but I wanted to make sure it got out there.
The infrastructure. So I can really only speak in the U.S. that there are cross-country, you could do it now, I'd say. There are companies that have been around for years or programs such as, I think it's called Charge Across America, but people have mapped, EV enthusiasts have mapped where the charging points are. So you could drive across 3,000 miles of the U.S. So it's there. It just depends on how much of an enthusiast. I think they are, the industry has been addressing range anxiety. I think that's the biggest barrier for adoption. Mm-hmm. And so the infrastructure is coming as more OEMs come online. So this is interesting because it actually goes into the final talk I'm talking about with wireless charging and how infrastructure is working with this. But there are essentially 3 phases of what we'll see with charging. And so you have the OEMs who are doing it on their own. So for example, Tesla and Porsche. And then you have the corporations such as ChargePoint that are doing that in private industry. And then there are also the consortiums. So BMW and Daimler has one. So they're really trying to set up the infrastructure to do this.
Awesome.
Okay. So the next trend is that EVs are having a global impact. So let's go over global sales. I want to start with China. So China is the world's largest car market, and this graph shows EV sales. So the dark part of the graph is China, and then the blue part is the rest of the world. And this, as I've said before, that this is actually, so China's kind of dictating how automakers are planning. So for example, Volkswagen sells 40% of its vehicles, sold 40% of its vehicles in China last year. And so they say that they will introduce 40 locally produced EV models in China within the next decade. BMW sells more cars in China than anywhere else. And they're going to make 2 plug-in hybrids, and they plan to produce 2 more EV pure electric cars in 2020. So not only will we show how, I'll show a little bit later about just how government mandates are making OEMs draw them out, but also show later how it will affect oil demand. Here's some more information about EV sales in Norway. And the EV is a special, Norway is a special case, and they have generous incentives that aren't found elsewhere. But the point of this map shows that change can happen fast. So it took Norway about 10 years to reach 6% EV sales, but then only 5 years to go from 6% to 47%. So let's compare that to California. This chart shows the sales in California of hybrids versus plugins. And the plugins are the line and the hybrids are the bar graphs. And you see in 2017 that plugins move ahead of hybrids in sales, which they look like they're trending down more. And we'll need a few more years in retrospect to see whether this is an inflection point. But we're right around the 6% number, so we'll see if that's an inflection point for California in the same way that it was for Norway. So all of these EVs are displacing oil. So this chart shows the demand for gasoline in Italy has fallen by nearly half since 2005. Also in Germany, demand for diesel fell 9% in the first half of 2018. And by the end of 2018, it was projected that electric buses and cars would displace just shy of 300,000 barrels of oil a day. And that's the daily consumption of Greece. Daily oil consumption of Greece. So the next trend I want to talk about is, I want to stay in the realm of electric power, but I want to talk about gallium nitride. And I want to start with this picture because this picture is from CES, was released last week during CES, and it really spoke to me. So what we have here are laptop chargers. And on the right is the stock laptop charger. Looks very familiar for Apple computers. And then on the left is what Anker announced. And this is a laptop charger that is of equal power, but it's 40% smaller. So what I think is the point I'm trying to show is that GaN is about to overtake silicon. So for decades, silicon has been the backbone of technology, but as it's approaching its theoretical limits. So gallium nitride, or GaN, is going to take us into the next generation and displace silicon. So what is GaN? It's a crystal that's well suited for high power transistors used in LEDs, semiconductor power devices, RF components, and lasers. It's used in Blu-ray. It has a blue light, so it gave the blue for Blu-ray. And it's a lot more power efficient. So in measurements, it has been reported to be 13 times better in performance than silicon MOSFETs, which is what we've been using for decades. It's the traditional conductor. And it performs 6 times better than silicon carbide. And what's really neat about it is that it has a reduced size and it's lighter weight. So that will make a difference in cars. And there's a lower cost barrier. So what happened in 2010 is that they were able to produce this GaN crystal on silicon wafers. And so they're using the same process as silicon. And so that means that it's on equipment that is understood and has already been capitally depreciated. So what are the applications in automotive? So as I spoke about earlier, the components are lighter and smaller, so that makes more efficient fuel efficiency in EVs. And there's going to be a lot of uses in AVs because they require a lot of computing power. So it's going to be used in sensors and LiDARs. And what's neat about this is that actually what I'm really excited about is wireless charging. And this is what's going to make AVs truly autonomous, because as of right now, a human still needs to charge the vehicle. So what does that look like for wireless charging? And so I spoke with Paul Wiener of GaN Systems, and they make GaN-powered semiconductors. And I asked him to explain what it would look like. And he told me to imagine a charging pad that's about the size of a pizza box, and it's installed in the ground. And you could either have it installed in your ground, or you can go to, say, an AutoZone and buy an aftermarket device and install it in your garage or your parking spot. And there are copper coils in it, and the way that you charge is that you just drive over it and park, and And he says that this is something we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years. And you can also consider how this might affect the power grid. So imagine if you're charging at home and your car charges to 200 miles. And let's say that in a smart grid, you only need 50 miles to commute. So there's the scenario where you drive to work halfway, say 25 miles. And while you're parked at work, you could sell your excess power to the grid while leaving enough for you to get home. So the wider dream is that the roads could power the cars as you drive over them. So there's the interim step right now. Sweden last year has a 2-kilometer stretch of road that powers the car, but it's wired, and so there's physical friction that happens between the car and the road. And there's even a wider vision of how you could use the wireless charging to electrify a remote island, for example.
And Liz, are you seeing any companies working in this space, or is it kind of a quietly worked on section right now? Because it seems like a not so far off future technology. It actually sounds like it's fairly close, as you said. But who do you know that might be working on this, and when can we expect this to come to a driveway or parking lot near us?
Yeah, so what I was told from GAN Systems is that there are companies that are actively working on it, and it's really no longer niche, and that's why I'm excited about it. It's something that we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years. I was told, so for example, GAN System has 12 customers in production and thousands in testing, and investment is coming. So for example, there's a company called FreeWire Technologies, and they specialize in mobile rapid charging systems for EVs. And last year, BP Ventures invested $5 million, and Volvo bought a stake in FreeWire Technologies. BMW is taking this seriously. They invested $5 million in GAN Systems. Volvo invested in the wireless charging company Momentum Dynamics. So one of the reasons I'm really excited about it is that we are like right before mass adoption, and then this is going to overtake silicon. And I realize that silicon, like in semiconductors, is not something we talk about it in cars, but we don't really go do a deep dive. But it's what powers our daily life. So, for example, there was a report that in 2016, every person on the planet, on average, bought about 111 circuits and semiconductors every year, or that year. So it's something you don't see, but it's kind of the unseen power.
Got it. And that's based on the devices they're buying, I'm assuming as well. Unless everyone here is buying semiconductors from OEMs. That's a great stat.
All right. So thanks so much for having me. I can take questions now.
Awesome. Well, Liz, awesome insights. A lot of people were commenting on the value of the information provided, and the landscape looks very exciting as well. I know from the last landscape to this one, it seems like a lot has progressed. What were maybe some of the areas that you saw the biggest progression in from the last quarter to this quarter?
So the on-demand rides is very different. I don't know if it's necessarily different from the last quarter, 3 months, but it's something we've seen in the last year. And so that was when I was talking about the consolidation and how Uber has bought Jump, and Lyft bought Motivate, which runs those city like city bike rentals. It's the name you don't know. Motivate is the name you don't know, and usually what happens is that Citibank or Ford sponsors it, but they run those networks.
So they run the infrastructure and the network as the corporate sponsors jump in, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Okay. Well, and then we've got a few questions, so I'm going to kind of run down them. Dave has a general question around the conversion of older vehicles. I know this is a growing topic and something I've seen a lot of startups personally working on. And that's the idea of bringing cars pre-electric or pre-sensors into the current day or even in future. Have you seen or heard of any programs during your research that are focused primarily on that upgrade part of the connected car. So bringing a 1980, or as Dave pointed out, a 1970-ish vehicle into the connected car era with sensors and potentially even EV.
Yeah, there were a couple examples, although I can't remember the specific names of the companies, but I remember going to events and there would be aftermarket electrifying cars. So there was one where it was after the, I think they worked with the factories, but it was like after it went off the factory line, they would electrify heavy duty trucks. Sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but there are a couple of people that are companies that are looking into that, making that happen.
Hey, Dave, we'll get back to you on that company name. Go ahead, Kailash.
Yeah, sorry, just to add on to that list. So there are a couple of companies, Specific EV, for example. That's one company which converts existing vehicles to run on electric, right? There's also Make Mine Electric. And so that's another company that focuses on high-end cars, high-end vintage cars, and how they make that electric. So those are two examples here in this space.
Awesome.
Liz, we talked a lot about infrastructure around the future of charging and how that plays into autonomous. But another topic that I've seen continually coming atop is around dealerships and the future of dealerships. Mm-hmm. Here in the U.S., it seems like there's a dealership on most corners, whereas in other countries it's a little different. But what do you see as the future role of a car dealership as we get into more EV type vehicles, and we get into autonomous, and we get into wireless charging, et cetera? Where does the car dealership play a role? Do they grow? Do they scale back? What does that look like in their future?
I'm glad you asked. In terms of dealerships, I don't think they scale back. I think they're really working hard to maintain their status. There are lobbyists that keep it the way it is. I think because there was controversy when Tesla started out and they didn't have dealers. They had their own showrooms. And I think there was a political fight behind that and how that worked, how that played out. But dealerships still have maintenance and service that they provide, and that will still be a part of it. So as I was mentioning, I like to mention Carforce, because what they are doing is they're working with dealers, and they have they consider themselves a data company. The way that they're doing it right now is having an aftermarket dongle that you plug into the diagnostics port, and that alerts both the consumer and the dealer that maintenance is required on the car, and it helps them helps each party figure out what service is needed for that car.
Yeah, so kind of the preventative maintenance role.
Right, or if it happens in time.
Or real time.
You'll know exactly when it happens.
What about, this is a very interesting point that Rudy brought up. We've heard when your computer needs an update, you get notified of a software update, you update it over a wireless network generally. We have this term now in the blockchain and crypto world about airdrop and the idea of sending tokens to mass groups. In the connected car space, do we see OEMs and dealerships working together to send over-the-air software updates so that, say, your Tesla or your BMW or whatever future vehicle you have, you're able to get an update while driving, or you're able to get an update while the car sits in your driveway from, call it the central dealership as well? How do you see that playing a role in the future?
They do have over-the-air updates, and I'm glad that OEMs are starting to adopt it more in the last 5 years. They really poo-pooed it, I'd say 5 years ago when I went to conferences. But they're starting to adopt it. I think it's great. It's definitely not something you'd see as you're actively driving. It's probably going to be somewhere where you are at home on a Wi-Fi network, just to be more efficient about how the connectivity happens. And it's actually a big part of the security of the car is to make sure that the latest software is on the device, on the vehicle.
And talking about security, so this is one area we covered in the landscape, and it looked like there was about 16 different companies. And it seems like it's a growing concern, and reasonably so. There's several discussions or instances of cybersecurity attacks on vehicles. How do you see that landscape evolving in the future? Security being a growing concern, probably more so than distance or range. What did you find around this security and what people are working on, and how that will look for our future, so we feel safer in a vehicle that's completely open to the network, and at any point someone could get in?
Sure. So I have a lot on cybersecurity, and I've broken it down into what the motivations are for hacking. That it's research based, which is what we've seen most of a couple years ago when you saw it in the news. It is some hackers do it for recognition, and then there's the financial aspect. So you'll see a lot of that mostly with credit card and data breaches and things like that. The car is harder to hack because it varies. You cannot hack once and deploy everywhere. It varies from maker to maker, model to model, year to year. So the financial motivation isn't quite there. Although I do get concerned when I see things like Amazon or things that are connected with a credit card on a car, because then that starts to spark, or even payments in the car, which is something that I really like and would like to see. It's something that can motivate hackers. In terms of what's going to happen in the landscape, the way that it has to work is it's going to, if it expands it's going to expand slowly, because this is something in which you have to become a supplier for the OEM. And that is, that's a long process. But once you're in, you only can be the supplier for really one OEM. You don't tend to be able to supply multiple. And that's just how they're very siloed. That's just how the industry works.
Got it. And you brought up finance, and finance being a part of this experience of this vehicle. It sounds like the common theme here is that the vehicle and the way that we look at mobility will be more experience based than it is today. What do you see on the infotainment side? Do you see that being a bigger trend for the connected car industry, that while these devices, sensors, autonomous, all of that plays the big role of laying down the infrastructure and how we move, but infotainment, what role does that play as autonomous takes over, as wireless charging takes over? No longer do we need to get in and out of the car. We just get in, go from point A to point B. How does infotainment and finance and payments and stuff like that play a role in this future?
In terms of infotainment, it's mostly been centered around music for the past few years, and also whether or not to sync with your phone. When I got started about 5 or 6 years ago, OEMs didn't. They would talk about how this isn't an iPhone on wheels and how they want to have their own experience, and so that's why you see in the infotainment applications section that Toyota and Nissan all have their own offerings, instead of it just being CarPlay, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto everywhere. But I haven't really seen much outside of other applications. I mean, it's something I actually explored because I was building a car app developers platform and trying to figure out what the use cases are. They're mostly, and at the time, most people just want to listen to music and make sure that it's synced with their phone. I've addressed distracted driving as part of it. So as well as, what other use cases? Yeah, it's mostly like those kinds of things that you get on your phone.
Well, and it sounds like on the charging side too. I mean, charging is going to have a cost. So if finance is a part of that, you can roll up to a wireless charging station, your credits are taken or your credit card is charged, and at no point do you have to get out of your car as well. But leads into a great question from John is, how do you see the role of insurance or the need for driver's license with autonomous vehicles?
Insurance, something, since this is AV, I really would prefer to defer it to Mark and his talks, but yeah, because I haven't really thought about specifically insurance for AVs.
Yeah.
I can talk a little bit about like how the market has changed for pay as you drive or
Yeah.
usage-based insurance. I think those are interesting, and it makes it more efficient for everyone, and it also helps. It's helpful for the insurance companies because it helps decrease fraud, and it helps the consumer because if they don't drive a lot, then they don't have to pay a lot.
Got it. And then this might also be a little bit for Mark, but let's take a jump into it. Is how do you see the new 5G networks and its impact on the autonomous or autopilot options for electric vehicles, including wireless charging as well?
Yeah, I think I'll defer that one to Mark.
All right.
Yeah.
No worries. Go ahead.
Just to jump in. So, I mean, on the 5G front, I think the way it's really going to have an impact is on the vehicle to infrastructure. So cellular V2X, for example, is going to be is something that is big, and so it's going to really enable or push applications which are data intensive, and that's specifically when we move towards AV, things like how can you have both local intelligence within the car as well as cloud-based intelligence, but then have that cloud-based intelligence reach the car much faster. So with 5G, that's something that I predict is going to happen. And on the previous point about infotainment as well, I think ride-hailing is one of probably like a precursor to applications that consumers can enjoy in a fully autonomous vehicle era. So cargo, like Liz mentioned in her talk, that's one interesting company because they are now engaging with ride hailers, and when they are in the car, they're now they can kind of demo products or sample products, or even make in-car purchases. So I think that's also really good to have an eye on, at least moving into the AV era.
Which sounds like it'll introduce new business models and new opportunities for profitability for all of these companies as a whole, whether they're the supplier, they're the OEM, they're the product company, the data company, or the vehicle company as well, which sounds exciting. Liz, thank you so much. Unless we have any other questions, would love to hear your final thoughts on this landscape, what any other tidbits you have, and then also what you see as kind of your future forward thinking on the next quarter and even as far as the next year around this industry.
Well, what Kailash and I have been talking about for looking forward, and something we might want to cover, is what's going on, the creative ways that mobility is happening worldwide, and India has always been an amazing example. So we might look into that because you're seeing two-wheel cars, vehicles being more popular because they're more accessible to the people of India. So it's a lot cheaper. And so I might explore creative ways on how that one's happening. And then for the next quarter, we'll just see, because these things happen really fast, right? Everyone talks about how scooters and bikes came out of nowhere and infiltrated their cities. So,
do you think we'll go from bikes to scooters to skateboards, or what do you think might be next in that ride sharing type model?
What was it? I'm curious what's going to happen with mass transit. That one's kind of changing up. Chariot just announced that they're closing. And so I know that I've seen that one struggle, which is a bummer because they're trying to create mass transit and help people commute and make it affordable. And they're starting to work with the cities to do that, which is nice and creates an easy transition. I don't know. I think also what this is with mobility, what people are trying to transform is whether they get around and whether they do things remote, whether they work remote or they or they get things delivered. So we'll see.
Right on. Awesome. Well, everybody, thank you very much for joining. Liz, again, thank you so much for all the work and time you put into the landscape with Kailash and the rest of the team. This looks great. It looks like it's going to be an exciting next quarter to see how things evolve and change. For those who joined, thank you for all the questions, comments. Charlie, thank you for all of the continued links and tidbits that you put in. I've collected those and we'll send them off to the team, and then also include them in the presentation for review afterwards. Also, if there was anything you missed, if you had any additional questions, you can reach out to us as a team, but also feel free to take a look at the webinar. The slides and everything will be available on readwritelabs.com later this week. And Kailash, you want to take us out with the next week's webinar?
Yes, thanks, thanks, Kyle, and thank you also. So next week, it's going to be an interesting webinar on renewable energy. So renewable energy is probably the fastest growing source of energy globally, and nearly a quarter of the world's energy is being generated by renewable sources. These can include biomass, geothermal, solar, hydro. And so in the next webinar, we'll deep dive into how to harness these technologies while saving time and reducing cost. So we'll be joined by Chris Chirillo and Philippe Cass. And so we look forward to seeing you all next week, same time for this webinar. So that's what's happening next. Again, I wish you all have a great rest of the week and the weekend, and hope to see you soon next week. Thanks, Liz, once again for your time. We shall be sending out all the resources on this webinar over email, as well as the slides would be accessible on our platform. So that's all from us. Have a great rest of the day and a great weekend.